There is a word inside the New Testament that has been sitting in plain sight for 2,000 years, not hidden in a vault, not sealed inside a monastery, not suppressed into a manuscript that required special permission to read, printed in every Bible that has ever been published, translated into every language that ever carried the Christian faith. And yet this word has been doing something that almost no one who reads it has ever noticed. Every time a translator encounters it, they face a choice. In some verses they render it as healed. In other verses they render it as saved. In others they write made well or made whole. Different English words, different meanings, different worlds. But in the original Greek text of the Gospel accounts, it is always the same word. One word. Every time. Jesus never chose between healing a person and saving them. His language did not offer him that choice. The word held both realities at once. Jesus used this word when he reached out to a blind man, and the man's sight returned on the spot. He used this word when a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years touched the edge of his garment in a pressing crowd and felt the hemorrhage stop before he had even turned around to face her. He used this word when he spoke to a man who had been unable to walk for years and sent him home carrying the mat he had arrived on. And he used this same word when he addressed a woman who had never been physically ill at all, who came to him carrying only the weight of a life she was ashamed of. 4 different people. 4 completely different conditions. One word. Every time. And the translators split it into separate English words and placed those words in separate categories. And 2,000 years later, the split is so deep and so complete that the original connection has become nearly invisible. Modern medicine cannot explain that word, because modern medicine was not built to hold what it contains. Modern medicine heals the body. Modern theology saves the soul. They operate in different buildings, on different assumptions, with different vocabularies and different measures of success. If you walk into a hospital and tell the physician that you believe your illness is connected to something unresolved in your spirit, you will be referred to psychiatry or to the chaplain's office. If you walk into a church and tell the priest your body is failing and prayer alone has not turned the tide, he will encourage you to keep praying and to see your doctor. The line between these 2 domains feels so natural, so obvious, so ancient, that almost no one stops to ask when it was drawn. Almost no one asks who drew it. And almost no one stops to ask whether the man in whose name both prayer and healing have been offered for 2,000 years actually recognized the dividing line at all. He did not. And the evidence that he did not is sitting in the Greek text of the New Testament, right now, documented and verifiable, in the word the translators have been splitting for nearly 2 millennia. What you are about to discover is not a conspiracy. It is not a suppressed manuscript. It is not a secret council that voted in the dark to hide a teaching from ordinary believers. It is a word. A single word that modern civilization has been living on 2 sides of, without realizing there was ever just one side. And before this video is done, you will know exactly what it means, where it comes from, and why the tradition that was built after Jesus never wanted you to see it whole. From where are you watching right now? Write your country in the comments. I am genuinely fascinated to know how many true seekers of truth like you are finding these revelations from every corner of the world. Tell me below. Because what follows is not interpretation. It is not one scholar's reading against another's. It is the word itself, sitting in the ancient text, doing something the translation does not allow it to do. The key to understanding that word begins with a fact that changes everything about how we read the Gospel accounts. Jesus did not speak Greek. According to Dr. Bart Ehrman, James A. Gray, distinguished professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Jesus spoke Galilean Aramaic as his primary language, the everyday spoken language of first-century Galilee. The Gospels we hold in our hands are not originals. They are translations. Everything Jesus said came first in Aramaic. His prayers, his healing commands, the words he cried from the cross at the moment of his death. All of it existed first in a Semitic language before any Greek speaker wrote it down. And the translation, the movement from living Aramaic into Greek and then from Greek into Latin, changed the shape of what the words could carry. Not because the translators were dishonest, because no two languages contain the same universe inside them. Something always transforms in the crossing, and what transformed in the crossing from Aramaic into Greek is precisely what this video is about. In the Aramaic-speaking Judaism of first-century Galilee, healing and salvation were not separate categories requiring separate professionals. What afflicted the body and what burdened the soul were understood through the same vocabulary, the same word roots, the same semantic fields. When Jesus spoke, he was not selecting from two separate menus, one medical and one religious. He was speaking inside a single vocabulary that had never divided them. His words were whole in a way that Greek could only partially carry, and Latin could barely hold at all. And that is where this story begins, not in a banned gospel, not in a buried cave, not in a council vote. It begins in a single Greek word that has been split by translators, not because they were deceptive, but because the languages they translated it into were simply not built to hold what it means. The word is there. It has always been there. It is in every Bible you have ever held. And once you understand what it actually contains, the healing accounts of Jesus will never read the same way again. But before we arrive at that word, look at something inside the Gospels themselves. Something that is not hidden and has never been hidden, but that passes without comment in almost every church and every Bible study that has ever discussed these passages. Of the four canonical Gospels, only one does something the others refuse to do. Only one preserves the actual words Jesus spoke in the moments when he healed someone, not translated into Greek, not rendered differently. The original sounds, the original syllables, sitting inside the Greek text, like something the writer simply could not bring himself to replace. Mark's Gospel, which the scholarly consensus identifies as the oldest of the four, contains two healing phrases from Jesus in his actual Aramaic. Two moments where the text does not translate what he said. It records what he said in the language he said it in, and then provides the Greek meaning in the very next sentence, as if the writer understood that these particular sounds could not be handed over to another language without losing something that mattered. Those two phrases are Talitha Cumi and Ephatha. Matthew and Luke both tell the same stories those phrases appear in. Neither of them kept the Aramaic. Only Mark held on to the sound of the original voice. That fact is worth sitting with. One gospel preserved what the other two quietly replaced. The question of why is not a small question. It is the entrance to everything this video is about. And the word this entire video is built around is waiting just on the other side of it. The house is already loud with the sound of weeping when they arrive. That is what Mark records. Not that the family was grieving quietly. Not that a few relatives had gathered. The house was full of people crying and wailing, because word had come that a young girl was dead, and the community had done what communities do in that world, which was to assemble immediately and fill the space with grief. Her father had gone out earlier, had found Jesus in the middle of a pressing crowd somewhere on the road, had fallen to his knees in front of him and begged him to come before she died. He did not make it in time. By the time they reach the house, a messenger arrives at the door to say so. Do not trouble the teacher any further. It is too late. She is gone. Jesus goes in anyway. He tells the mourners that the child is not dead, but sleeping, and they laugh at him. Mark records it with no softening. They laughed at him. He clears all of them out of the room. He takes only the girl's parents and 3 disciples inside. He crosses to where the girl is lying. He takes her by the hand. And then he speaks. Not to God. Not to anyone watching. He does not invoke a prayer formula, does not call on the name of a prophet or patriarch, does not perform any recognizable religious procedure. He says 2 words in Aramaic, directly to the child, in the same quiet voice you would use to wake a daughter in the morning. Talitha Kumi. Only after recording those words does Mark supply the translation, Little girl, I say to you, arise. The word Talitha in Aramaic means little girl. In certain Aramaic dialects, it also carries the affectionate sense of little lamb. The word kumi is the feminine imperative. Arise, get up, rise. Direct. Personal. The instruction is not addressed to the room or to the heavens. It is addressed to her specifically, in the diminutive, the way a parent speaks to a child they love. The command and the tenderness arrive in the same breath. Matthew and Luke both include this story. Both Gospels tell you about this moment. Neither of them kept the Aramaic. They translated directly into Greek and left the original sound behind. That absence in Matthew and Luke is not neutral. It means that in the decades between this event and the writing of the Gospels, at least 2 Gospel writers looked at whatever source material they had and decided the foreign language phrase was unnecessary. They handed the reader the meaning and discarded the sound. Mark looked at the same kind of material and made the opposite decision. Mark decided the sound was too important to lose. The question of why is not a small one. It opens everything. But here's what's fascinating. Why would one gospel preserve the exact Aramaic when 2 others, telling the same story, chose not to? The explanation is not literary preference. According to Richard Barkham, Emeritus Professor of New Testament Studies at the University of St. Andrews and Fellow of the British Academy, Mark's Gospel is grounded in named eyewitness testimony. In his work, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, published by Eerdmans in 2006, Barkham argues at length that the specific details preserved in Mark, the physical gestures, the named individuals, the untranslated phrases from particular rooms in particular moments, are precisely the kind of material that direct eyewitness memory holds on to. A translator, working from a second-hand account, has no reason to preserve a foreign language phrase that readers will not understand. The phrase means nothing to a Greek-speaking audience unless someone explains it, which is why Mark explains it. Someone transmitted the original sound. Someone remembered Talitha Kumi, not just what it meant, but how it sounded in that room. And that kind of precision doesn't survive across decades of transmission unless it was carried by someone who was actually present. The Aramaic preserved in Mark is not decoration. It is the fingerprint of proximity. It is what eyewitness memory keeps that paraphrase let's go. Now move to Mark 7, a different kind of closed body, a different kind of silence. A man is brought to Jesus who cannot hear and whose speech is impaired. The people with him beg Jesus to lay a hand on him. And what Mark records next is the most physically detailed healing account in the Gospels. Jesus takes the man aside privately, away from the crowd. He puts his fingers directly into the man's ears. He spits, and with the moisture from his own mouth, he touches the man's tongue. He looks up toward heaven. He sighs deeply, and then he speaks. One word, in Aramaic, spoken not to the crowd, not to the disciples watching, but directly at the sealed places in this man's body. Ephphatha. Mark translates it in the same sentence. Be opened. And the man's ears were opened, and the binding of his tongue was released, and he spoke clearly. The word Ephphatha in Aramaic means be opened, in the passive imperative. To be released from a seal. To have what is closed become open. And that vocabulary of opening and releasing belongs to the same word family as the Aramaic root for forgiveness, which means to untie, to let go, to release what binds. The connection between those two ideas is not accidental, and it is not finished here. It will return later in this video with its full weight. For now, notice only this. One word, Aramaic, spoken directly at a body's sealed places, preserved verbatim inside a Greek gospel. The same documentary discipline as the first phrase. The same refusal to replace sound with meaning alone. Gustav Dalman, the foundational scholar of Galilean Aramaic, documented in his 1894 work, Grammatik des Jüdisch-Palästinischen Aramäisch, the specific dialect Jesus would have spoken. Western Aramaic, Galilean variety. Dalman mapped the grammar, the vocabulary, the phonological patterns of that particular speech community from every available source, including the Palestinian Talmud, the Peshitta tradition, and documentary evidence spanning multiple centuries, and the transliterated syllables that Mark preserved inside his Greek text, these Aramaic sounds sitting inside the wrong alphabet, fit precisely within that documented dialect. They are not liturgical borrowings. They are not invented sounds added for effect. They are fragments of the actual spoken language of first-century Galilee, preserved by a writer who understood that these particular sounds could not be handed to another language without something real being lost. Here is what those two phrases establish together. Talitha Kumi tells us Mark was working close enough to the actual events to hold on to the sound of the actual moment. Ephphatha confirms it. They prove that Mark's healing material rests on something concrete and specific, something with a source close enough to the event to remember not just what happened, but how it sounded. And that matters enormously. Because Mark records another healing phrase, one that appears not in Aramaic but in Greek, one that does not appear once or twice, but 5 separate times, across different accounts. A phrase Jesus used so consistently, across such different people and conditions, that it became his standard formula, the exact formula. And because we know Mark was working from a source this close, we can trust that formula too. That formula is not Talitha Kumi. It is not Ephphatha. Those two phrases are the credential that earns our confidence in what comes next. The formula itself does something neither of them does. It crosses a boundary that modern medicine cannot cross because modern medicine was never built to stand where that boundary was. We are almost there. Tell me in the comments, did you already know that these Aramaic words were sitting inside the Gospel of Mark, preserved verbatim for 2,000 years? I am fascinated to know how much true seekers of truth like you already carry. Your experience can illuminate the path for others who are just now starting to ask these questions. Write it below. There is a phrase that appears in the healing accounts of Jesus more consistently than any other formula he ever used. More than any command. More than any prayer he spoke aloud. A phrase used with 5 completely different people in 5 completely different circumstances, spread across multiple Gospels, and every single time it is the same. 6 Greek words in the same sequence. The same 6 words whether the person before him was blind or bleeding or bowed down with grief or carrying an infirmity that no physician had ever been able to fix. Sesoken se hipistis so, that is the phrase. That is the formula. That is what modern medicine cannot explain. Not because the healings themselves defy explanation, though they do. Because the phrase does something that modern medicine has no structural category for. The phrase does not distinguish between healing the body and saving the soul. It covers both with the same 6 words, and never once indicates that these are 2 separate procedures requiring 2 separate vocabularies. And once you see what those 6 words actually contain, the entire framework you have been given for understanding Jesus as healer collapses and becomes something larger and stranger and more coherent than anything that replaced it. The first person to hear this phrase was a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years of a hemorrhage that no physician could stop. Mark 5:25 notes that she had suffered under the care of many doctors, had spent everything she owned on treatments, and had only grown worse. She heard that Jesus was passing through and pressed into the crowd to reach him. She told herself one thing: if I can only touch his garment, I will be healed. She touched it. The bleeding stopped immediately. Before she could withdraw, Jesus stopped and turned and said someone had touched him with intention, had drawn power from him. She came forward frightened and fell at his feet and told him everything. And he looked at her and said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Mark 5:34. The Greek. Sesoken se hipistis so. The second person was a blind beggar sitting at the roadside outside Jericho as Jesus and a large crowd passed by. He heard the noise of the crowd and asked what was happening. He was told Jesus of Nazareth was there. He began to shout. The people around him told him to be quiet. He shouted louder. Jesus stopped and told them to bring the man to him. He asked, "What do you want me to do for you?" The man said, "I want to see." And Jesus said, "Go, your faith has healed you." Mark 10:52. Sesoken se. The same phrase. The third person was one of 10 men with leprosy, who called out to Jesus from a distance on the border between Samaria and Galilee. Jesus told them to go and show themselves to the priests. As they went, they were cleansed. One of them turned back when he saw that he was healed. He fell at Jesus' feet and gave thanks. And Jesus said, "Rise and go, your faith has made you well." Luke 17:19. Sesoken se hipistis so. The fourth person was another blind man outside Jericho. He called out, was told to be quiet, called out again. Jesus stopped and asked what he wanted. "Receive your sight," Jesus said. "Your faith has healed you." Luke 18:42. Sesoken se. Fourth time, 4 people. 4 physical conditions. 4 times the same Greek phrase delivered over a restored body. But here comes the most controversial part. The fifth person Jesus said this phrase to had never been sick in her life. She was a woman in a city who had learned that Jesus was having dinner at a Pharisee's house. She came in uninvited, carrying an alabaster jar of perfume. She stood behind Jesus at his feet, weeping. Her tears fell on his feet. She wiped them with her hair. She kissed his feet and poured perfume on them. The Pharisee hosting the dinner watched all of this in silence and thought to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman is touching him. Jesus turned to the woman. He said, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Luke 7:50. The Greek. sesokense hypistiso, the exact same phrase, not healed. The translators write saved, because there is nothing physical to cure. This woman arrived with no illness. She left with no illness. Nothing in her body changed between the moment she walked in and the moment she walked out. And yet Jesus used the identical Greek formula over her that he used over a woman whose hemorrhage had just stopped, over a man whose eyes had just opened, over a leper whose skin had just cleared. Same verb, same formula, same 6 words. This is the anomaly that modern medicine has no vocabulary for. Modern medicine heals bodies. Modern theology saves souls. But Jesus used one word for both. And that word is the key to everything. The Greek verb in all 5 of those moments is sozo. According to the Bauer Danker, Arndt Gingrich, Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament, the standard scholarly reference for New Testament Greek in its 3rd edition, published by the University of Chicago Press in the year 2000, the verb sozo is documented as carrying 3 simultaneous meanings. To save spiritually, as in Romans 10:9, where Paul writes that the one who confesses with their mouth will be saved. To heal physically, as in Matthew 9:21 and 22, describing the exact same woman with the hemorrhage and using the exact same verb, and to make whole and restore completely. One verb, 3 realities at once, not 3 separate meanings requiring 3 separate contexts. One word that held all of them together without choosing between them. Every time a translator has rendered sesokense as healed you in one verse and saved you in another, they have split apart a word that was never split. The division is in the translation, not in the original text. And here's what's fascinating. That word sozo does not only appear in Jesus' healing formula, it appears in his name. Matthew 1:21 records the angel's instruction before Jesus is born. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. The Greek word rendered save there is sose, from sozo, the exact same root, the same verb. His name and his most consistent healing phrase were built from a single word. In the world he came from, in the Aramaic-speaking Judaism of 1st century Galilee, names were not bureaucratic labels. They were declarations of purpose and identity. A name named what you were and what you were for. And the name given to this child, the name carried across 2,000 years into every language on earth, was a declaration that what he would do for human beings could be contained in a single word that no translation has ever managed to hold in one piece. Sozo, to make whole, to heal, to save, all at once. We are living in days when these hidden truths are surfacing. I have prepared a guide for you on the forgotten healing language of Jesus, with the full context of what you are discovering in this video. It is available in the pinned comment below. Subscribe to this channel and activate the bell notification so you do not miss any revelation that follows. But sozo is itself a translation. That is the thing. The phrase that Jesus used 5 times across the Gospel accounts is not the original layer. It is the Greek layer. It is what his words became when they crossed the language barrier from Aramaic into the Greek his followers wrote in. And underneath the Greek there is an Aramaic vocabulary that carries what sozo was already trying to say, except that in Aramaic the connection between healing and forgiving and being made whole is not a matter of 2 meanings sharing one word. It is a matter of root, of word family, of a single breath of meaning that runs through everything Jesus said about human beings and what could happen to them. In Aramaic, the word for forgiveness means to untie. The word for peace means wholeness. These are not metaphors. They are the vocabulary, and we go into it now. There is a Bible that most people who call themselves Christians have never encountered. It was not hidden in a cave or suppressed by a council. It has been in continuous use for nearly 2,000 years, read aloud in churches from Syria to India, and carried by the communities who prayed and worshipped in a language closer to the language Jesus actually spoke than any other surviving Christian tradition. It is the Peshitta, the standard Syriac Bible of the Aramaic-speaking churches. And the Peshitta preserves something that the Greek and Latin translations could only approximate. Not because the translators were careless, because Aramaic carries a meaning that Greek and Latin were never built to hold whole. Open the Peshitta to the Lord's Prayer, the prayer Jesus taught his disciples to say every day. In Aramaic it opens, Abun Debashmaya, our Father who is in heaven. But the word that matters most for this video is not the opening word. It is a word in the middle of the prayer, the line that English translations render as forgive us our debts. In Aramaic, Ushvuk lan hobain. And the word shvuk, the word translated as forgive, is unlike anything the English word forgiveness suggests, because in Aramaic, the word for forgiveness does not mean pardon. It does not mean the legal acquittal of a guilty party. It means something physical, something concrete, something you do with your hands. The Aramaic verb shabak, from the root shbq, carries this documented semantic range in the Peshitta tradition: to release, to let go, to leave alone, to untie, to permit, to abandon. When Jesus used this root in the Lord's Prayer, he was not teaching his followers to ask God for a verdict. He was teaching them to ask God to untie them, to release the bonds, to let go of the hold the debt and guilt and accumulated injury have on a human soul. Not a judicial act, an act of physical release, like cutting a rope, like opening a knot. The same root appears again in Luke 23-34, in the words Jesus speaks from the cross. Mark records it in Aramaic, Abba shvuk lon. Father, untie them from this. Release them. Let go of the hold this moment has on them. That is what the Aramaic says. Not a courtroom declaration, an act of loosening. And it appears again in the healing of the paralytic at Capernaum, where the same root, the same untying, is the first thing Jesus does before a single muscle in the man's body moves. Hold that thought, because there is a second root that belongs beside Shabak. It is the root from which healing and peace and wholeness all come from the same breath. The Aramaic word shlama, from the root eshlem, carries this meaning: whole, complete, intact, sound, healthy, unharmed. It is the root beneath the Hebrew shalom, which English translations render as peace, but which does not primarily mean the absence of conflict or a feeling of calm. It means the condition of completeness, the state where nothing is missing, nothing is fractured, nothing is absent that should be present. When Jesus healed the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years and said to her, "Go in peace," in Aramaic he said, "Go in shlama," go in wholeness. The healing he had just performed and the word he sent her away with were the same word. She arrived incomplete. She left whole. And that word described both the transition and the state she entered. When Jesus appeared to his disciples after the resurrection, the Gospel of John records that he greeted them, and Mark includes that greeting at the shore. In Aramaic, that greeting would have been Shlama Aleikon, wholeness upon you. Not a pleasantry, an announcement that the condition of healed and restored and sound was being placed on them by the one who had been through death and was now standing in a body the other side of it. Two roots, Shabak, to untie, to release. Shlama, to restore to completeness. And now, in Capernaum, Jesus demonstrates in front of a room full of witnesses that in his vocabulary, these two things are one operation. Jesus is inside a house, and the crowd outside has become so thick that no one can get through the door at all. 4 men arrive carrying a paralyzed man on a mat. They cannot get in. They do not turn back. They climb to the roof, break through it, and lower the man down on the mat, directly in front of Jesus, in the middle of the room. Mark 2:5 says that when Jesus saw their faith, the faith of the 4 men who tore a roof open to get their friend to him, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Shabak, released, untied. The religious scholars in the room react immediately. Who does this man think he is? To forgive sins is to do what only God does. This is blasphemy. They do not say it out loud. Mark records that they were thinking it. And Jesus turns to them and asks the question that is the center of everything this video has been building toward. Which is easier to say to a paralyzed man, "Your sins are forgiven," or "Get up and walk"? And then he says both. He says, "So that you know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say to you, get up, take your mat, and walk." The man gets up. He takes the mat. He walks out through the crowd. Jesus has performed the demonstration. He has answered the question not with an argument, but with a body walking out of a room it was carried into. In his vocabulary, the untying and the restoration to wholeness are not 2 separate procedures. They are one act. The man arrived bound. He left whole. Shabak and Shlama in one moment, performed by one person, described by one word family, in one language that never separated them. According to Geza Vermes, the first professor of Jewish studies at Oxford, serving from 1965 to 1991, writing in his foundational work, Jesus the Jew, published by Collins in London in 1973. Jesus was not operating in isolation. He was working within a recognized pattern of charismatic Galilean healers documented in rabbinic literature, men who addressed God with direct intimacy and performed healings through spoken words and prayer. The Babylonian Talmud, in Berakot 34b, records one such healer who healed the son of Rabban Gamliel at a distance, then announced to the messengers who had been sent to find him the exact moment the fever had broken, before they themselves could have known. The parallel to Jesus healing the centurion's servant without going to the house, in Matthew 8:5-13, speaking the word from where he stood, and the distant body responding, is close enough to indicate a shared tradition of practice. What distinguished Jesus within that tradition, Vermes argues, was not that he healed, or that he prayed, or that he spoke with authority. It was that he did not invoke God. He spoke in his own name. The healing came from him directly, not through petition. Now, there is a scholar who has spent decades attempting to recover what the Aramaic words of Jesus feel like from the inside rather than the outside. Neil Douglas Klotz, born in 1951, working extensively from the Peshitta tradition, renders the opening word of the Lord's Prayer, Abwoon, not as Father, but as something like, O breathing life of all, drawing on every possible Semitic root available to him. Mainstream Aramaic scholars, including Sebastian Brock of Oxford, have pushed back on these renderings as stretching beyond what the etymology strictly supports. That criticism is fair. But what both sides agree on is the underlying fact this chapter has been demonstrating, that Aramaic holds forgiveness and peace and health and wholeness inside the same word families in ways that Greek and Latin cannot reproduce, and that any translation loses something of that unity. That part is not contested. The unity is there. Jesus spoke inside it. And what was done to the vocabulary he spoke inside is what the next chapter will show you. Before any of this happened, it was already written down. Not in the Gospels, not in any text connected to Jesus or his followers. On a scroll of papyrus, in a clay jar, in a cave in the limestone cliffs above the Dead Sea, a community of Jewish scribes put ink on parchment and described what the coming Messiah would do. They were writing in Hebrew. They were writing before Jesus was born. Paleographers date this document to the first quarter of the 1st century, before the Common Era, which places the composition of this scroll approximately 1 century before the healings in the Gospel accounts. The scroll is called the Messianic Apocalypse. Scholars catalogue it as 4Q521. Cave 4, Qumran. The scroll was originally assigned for publication to Abbé Jean Starkey. Starkey died in 1988 without publishing it. After his death, the work was given to Father Émile Puech of the École Biblique in Jerusalem, who produced the published edition. And what Puech's edition reveals in Fragment 2, Column 2 of 4Q5/21, is a description of what the Messiah will do that should stop every viewer who has been following this video. The scroll says, "He will heal the wounded, give life to the dead, proclaim good news to the poor, and also, he who liberates the captives, restores sight to the blind, straightens the bent. Blind receiving sight, wounded healed, the dead raised to life, captives set free. Good news to the poor. That is not the agenda of a military conqueror or a political king. That is a healing vocabulary. That is the precise vocabulary of restoration and wholeness that has been running through every chapter of this video, and it was written as the messianic job description a century before Jesus began his public ministry. So when John the Baptist was sitting in prison, in real physical danger, confused about everything he had given his life to, and sent his disciples out to find Jesus and ask a single question, the question was this: are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else? Matthew 11:3. Not a casual inquiry. Everything depended on the answer. And Jesus does not say yes. He does something more precise than yes. He says, "Go back and tell John what you see and hear. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk. Those with leprosy are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. The good news is proclaimed to the poor." Matthew 11:4-5. That is not a list of recent events. That is a citation. He is quoting the vocabulary of 4Q521 directly back to John's disciples. He is answering the question, "Are you the one?" by demonstrating that he is doing what the one was written to do, in the language the one was written to do it in. The healing formula was not incidental to who he was. It was the proof of who he was. A messianic claim, encoded in the vocabulary of restoration and wholeness that had been in circulation for a century, that anyone who had encountered these texts would have recognized immediately. And the healing vocabulary of 4Q521 itself draws from something older still. Isaiah 53, written centuries before that scroll, the prophet writes, "Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering." Isaiah 53:4. And then, "By his wounds we are healed." Isaiah 53:5. The Hebrew word for healed in that line is nirpalanu, from the root rapha, heal, restore to health. And that root is the same root that appears in one of the most ancient names for God in the Hebrew Scriptures. Exodus 15:26. "I am the Lord who heals you." Yahweh Rapha. The healing nature of God, named in Exodus, carried forward into Isaiah, preserved in 4Q521, then arriving in the healing accounts of the Gospels. Matthew understood the chain. Matthew 8:17 states it plainly. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. The healing vocabulary of Jesus didn't originate with Jesus. It ran through him from a tradition that was already thousands of years deep. And now attend to what happens to that vocabulary at the very end. Mark 15:34, Matthew 27:46, the cross. Near the moment of death, Jesus cries out in Aramaic, not in Greek, not in liturgical Hebrew, in the language he actually spoke. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? It is Psalm 22:1, quoted in Aramaic, and the last word of that cry, sabachthani, contains the root ish-b-q, shabach, the same root as the word for forgiveness in the Lord's Prayer, the same root that produced the untying in Mark 2 when Jesus said, "Your sins are forgiven," the shabach that released the paralyzed man from what bound him and allowed his body to follow. On the cross, as Jesus dies, the word he used for releasing human beings from the bonds of sin and guilt and accumulated suffering becomes the word he uses for what is happening to him. Why have you untied me? Why have you released me into this? The healer who unbound others is now in the place of the unbound. There is no theology required. It is a linguistic fact. Now, December 1945, Upper Egypt. A farmer digging near a limestone cliff strikes a sealed earthenware jar. Inside it are leather-bound papyrus codices, buried for more than 1,600 years. Among them is a Coptic text that would eventually be recognized as one of the most significant Christian documents ever recovered. The Gospel of Thomas. 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. The physical manuscript dates to approximately 340 AD. Scholars place the original Greek composition somewhere between 50 and 140 AD. And inside that collection, in two sayings that few sermons have ever preached, Jesus describes the interior condition from which the miraculous proceeds. Logian 48. If two make peace with one another in this single house, they will say to the mountain, "Move away," and it will move. Logian 106. When you make the two one, you will become sons of man. And when you say, "Mountain, move away," it will move. The power does not come from technique. It does not come from authority or formula or the correct pronunciation of a word. It comes from a condition. The condition of the two becoming one. The condition of shlama. Wholeness is not what healing produces. Wholeness is what healing requires on the inside before it can move on the outside. And here is what was done to all of it. Around 170 AD, a Syrian Christian named Tachin, who had studied under Justin Martyr in Rome, composed a single continuous narrative harmony of all four Gospels, not four separate texts sitting on a shelf. One flowing text, used in churches the way one continuous scripture is used. This work is called the Diatessaron, and for more than 2 centuries it was the standard gospel text of Syriac-speaking Christianity, the communities geographically and linguistically closest to Jesus, the communities who read the healing accounts in the language the healings first occurred in. Then, in the 5th century, 2 bishops moved to remove it. Bishop Rabila of Edessa, serving from 411 to 435 AD, ordered that the Diatessaron be replaced in every church under his authority with the 4 separate Greek gospel texts. Bishop Theodoret of Cyrrhus, acting around 423 AD, went further. He personally traveled to the churches in his diocese and collected more than 200 copies of the Diatessaron and replaced them with the 4 Greek Gospels. He records this himself in his own work, the Hereticarum Fabularum Compendium. 200 copies removed and replaced. The Aramaic Gospel tradition was formally, documentably displaced. And then Jerome completed what those 2 bishops had started. The Latin Vulgate, commissioned by Pope Damasus in 382 AD and finished around 405, took the single Greek word sozo and split it into separate Latin words. Sano for the physical healings, salvo for the spiritual salvations, two Latin words where one Greek word had been. The unity that Greek had barely held together in one word was divided by Latin into two separate fields. Modern civilization inherited that division and eventually called it medicine and theology, body and soul, as if the split had always been there. It had not always existed. You have now seen when it was made. You came into this video with something you may not have fully recognized you were carrying, a sense that the connection between prayer and healing had once been something it no longer was, that the distance between the hospital and the church was not an original distance but a constructed one, and that something essential was missing from both institutions, and that the missing thing was the same in both cases, and that somewhere it had a name. You didn't know the name, but you felt its shape. You felt the place where it had been. You were right to feel it. And now you know the word. You uncovered two Aramaic phrases that the Gospel of Mark preserved verbatim, and that no other gospel was willing to keep. Talitha Kumi, Ephphatha, the sounds of the actual healing moments recorded in the original language embedded inside a Greek text for 2,000 years. You learned why Mark alone kept them, why one gospel preserved what two others had translated away, because Mark was working close enough to the original events to hold on to the actual sounds. The Aramaic was not decoration. It was the fingerprint of proximity. It was what direct memory preserves and second-hand transmission lets go. You discovered the phrase Jesus used 5 times across 5 different people in 5 completely different conditions. Sesoken sehi pistis so. Your faith has made you whole. You heard it spoken over a woman whose 12-year hemorrhage stopped when she touched his garment in a crowd. You heard it over a man on a roadside whose sight returned when Jesus told him to go. You heard it over a leper who turned back alone to give thanks while 9 others walked on. You heard it over another man begging outside a city gate. And then you heard the same 6 words spoken over a woman who had never been physically sick at all, who came to Jesus only with the weight of a life she was ashamed of, and you understood why the same formula covered all 5. Because the word sozo at the center of that formula was never limited to one dimension of human need. It held healing and salvation and restoration to completeness in the same breath, every time. You witnessed the scene in Mark 2, where Jesus made the demonstration explicit. He stood in a room in Capernaum and untied a man from his sin, and the man's paralyzed legs followed. Shabak and Shlama, working as one act. You traced those Aramaic roots and understood that the word for forgiveness means to untie, and the word for peace means wholeness. And that in the language Jesus spoke, these were not separate operations requiring separate authorities. You heard that same root cry from the cross in the word sabachthani, and you understood that the healer and the released share the same vocabulary at the end. You opened the Gospel of Thomas, buried 1,600 years in the Egyptian desert, and heard Jesus describe the interior condition from which the miraculous proceeds. Make the 2 one, and the mountain moves. You understood that shlama, wholeness, is not what healing produces. It is what healing requires on the inside before it can manifest on the outside. And you learned that none of this was new when Jesus said it. You found a Dead Sea Scroll from Cave 4 at Qumran, written a century before his birth, already describing the Messiah in the exact vocabulary of healing and restoration that Jesus used to answer John the Baptist. The tradition ran back through Isaiah, back through the name of God in Exodus, thousands of years before the Gospels. And then 2 bishops in the 5th century removed 200 copies of the Aramaic text that had been transmitting this vocabulary in the language it was spoken in. And a Latin translation split the single Greek word into 2. And modern civilization received the division and did not know anything had been divided. Now hear the plain statement. Modern medicine cannot explain the phrase "your faith has made you whole," because modern medicine was constructed on the premise that body and soul belong to separate domains with separate authorities. Neuroscience and cardiology and oncology operate on matter. Prayer and confession and forgiveness operate on spirit. They have separate buildings, separate degrees, separate vocabularies, and they do not often speak to one another about the same person. But in the language Jesus used, these were never separate. Sozo was one word, Shlama was one word, Shabak was one word. The woman who came to him with 12 years of hemorrhage, and the woman who came to him at the Pharisees' dinner with nothing but her grief, were both met with the same 6 Greek words, because the Aramaic beneath those words had never divided what Western civilization would eventually divide. The word for faith in that Aramaic vocabulary carries a root meaning firm, established, certain. Not the effort of believing something you doubt, the condition of standing in solid ground. Your established certainty, your rootedness in what does not let go, has made you whole, body and soul together, not as separate procedures conducted by separate institutions, as one restoration expressed in one word every single time. These words were not destroyed. That is the thing you need to carry from this video. When the Diatessaron was collected from those churches, Mark's Gospel still held the Aramaic. When the Latin Vulgate split sozo, the Greek manuscripts held it together. When the tradition was displaced from the communities that had carried it in the original language, the text survived. It waited 1,600 years in a sealed jar in the Egyptian desert and surfaced in 1945. It waited in the Greek lexicons until a standard scholarly reference documented in the year 2000 that sozo always carried all 3 meanings at once. Truth does not disappear. It waits for the moment when the people who need it are ready to receive it. You are watching this now. That is not coincidence. These revelations do not reach people by accident. They reach people who have been prepared to receive them. If you have ever felt that prayer and medicine were supposed to share a connection that neither institution could fully explain to you, you were not wrong. If you ever sat in a pew or a doctor's office and felt that the fullness of what it means to be a human being was not quite being addressed, you were not wrong. The connection was there the whole time. It was in the language. It was in the exact phrase. It was in a single Greek word that sozo preserves from an Aramaic original that never needed to split body from soul in the first place. You were right to feel the absence. What you felt was the shape of the word that was missing. Subscribe to this channel and activate the bell notification so you do not miss any revelation that follows from this one. There is more. The vocabulary we have uncovered in this video opens doors that this video only begins to walk through. The next video will continue into what has been hidden for centuries, and I do not want you to miss it when it arrives. Tell me in the comments the word from this video that stayed with you. Was it sozo, the one Greek word that holds healing and salvation and wholeness at once? Was it shlama, the peace that means completeness rather than calm? Was it Talitha Kumi, the sound of his actual voice in the room? Write the word. Write your country. I am genuinely moved to know how many people around the world are finding these truths at this moment, and your response opens a door for someone else who is just beginning to ask these questions. The exact phrase Jesus used that modern medicine cannot explain is this: your faith has made you whole. Not, your illness has been treated by the correct procedure. Not, your sin has been pardoned by the correct authority. Your faith, your groundedness, your certainty has restored you to completeness. Body and soul, matter and spirit, in one word. In his language, they were never two things. They were never two things. And now you